Welcome, friends, and settle in, because tonight we walk among a very particular kind of grave, the resting places of legends whose stories stubbornly refuse to end when their hearts stopped beating. These are the mysterious graves, the controversial ones, the tombs and crypts and scattered ashes around which the questions still swirl like mist long after the mourners have all gone home. For most of us, death is a full stop, a final and quiet punctuation at the end of a life. But for the men and women we visit tonight, death was something far stranger, a doorway opening onto decades of rumor and dispute and unanswered questions that have never once been laid to rest. Some of them died in ways that no coroner could ever fully explain, found in locked garages or lonely hotel bathtubs or on dark and silent stretches of open water. Their final hours, a puzzle that is argued over to this very day. Some of them were the victims of crimes that were never solved, their killers slipping away into history and leaving behind only whispers and cold cases. And for some, the very strangest chapter came after death itself, when their bodies were stolen out of the ground and held for ransom, or burned in the desert beneath the open sky, or lowered into a common grave whose exact location was somehow lost to the world forever. We will travel a great distance tonight, from the grand marble mausoleums of old Hollywood to a private island in the quiet English countryside, from a graffiti-covered tomb in the heart of Paris to a forgotten and leafy corner of a Viennese churchyard, and everywhere that we go, we will find the same three things waiting for us: a legend, a question, and a silence where the answer ought to be. Let me be very clear about how we will walk this uncertain path. We are not here to sensationalize anyone's suffering, nor are we here to declare wild theories to be settled fact. We will tell you plainly what is truly known, and we will tell you honestly what is merely suspected or whispered. And where the official record says one thing while the rumors insist upon another, we will lay them side by side and let you weigh them for yourself. For the mystery is not a stain upon these legends. It is, in its own strange and stubborn way, a part of their immortality, the very reason we still speak their names, still leave flowers at their graves, and still cannot quite bring ourselves to let them rest in peace. Consider for just a moment the strange company we are about to keep tonight. There are those among them whose very deaths are the mystery: a shot fired in an empty upstairs room, a body drawn cold from dark water, a delirious man discovered wandering in another person's clothes, each of them leaving behind a question that no jury and no coroner has ever managed to fully answer. There are those whose bodies themselves became the mystery, stolen away from consecrated ground, carried off into the night, set ablaze beneath the desert stars, or hidden behind a decoy stone, so that even the faithful who come to weep are kneeling in the wrong place entirely. And there are those whose graves are the mystery, sealed behind guarded doors that no visitor may ever pass, set upon islands that no boat may reach, or simply lost. Their exact whereabouts slip so completely from the memory of the world that the greatest composer who ever lived now sleeps somewhere beneath a quiet Viennese lawn that no living soul can precisely name. Each of these is only a different shade of the same haunting truth, that fame does not shield a person from the strangeness that can gather around their ending, and may, in the end, only invite more of it. The brighter the star, it seems, the longer and the darker the shadow it throws across all the years that follow. So, as we walk together, let us gently resist the easy temptation to treat these as mere ghost stories or as lurid entertainments. For behind every rumor is a real person who once lived and laughed and feared and hoped, and behind every unanswered question is a family that grieved, and in more than one case is grieving still. We will hold the wonder and the sorrow together in the same hand, and we will let the mysteries remain mysteries. For some doors, we shall find, are simply not ours to force open. So take my arm, and lower your voice, and step carefully as we go. For the ground here is uncertain, and the questions are old and deep. And let us begin in the cemetery where so many of Hollywood's darkest secrets lie buried, at the borrowed crypt of the greatest lover the silent screen ever knew. Let us begin at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, in the hushed marble corridors of the Cathedral Mausoleum, before a crypt that was only ever intended to be temporary, and yet has held its famous occupant now for very nearly a century. Rudolph Valentino was the great romantic idol of the silent era, the smoldering star of the Chic and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse and Blood and Sand, a man whose mere image upon a poster could send whole audiences into swoons of longing. He was, at the dizzying height of his fame, quite possibly the most desired man in all the world. And then, with shocking suddenness, he was gone, dying in New York in August of 1926 at just 31 years old, of complications following surgery for a perforated ulcer and appendicitis, an infection that the medicine of that day was helpless to stop. What followed was a spectacle of public grief, unlike anything the world had ever witnessed, as an estimated 100,000 people flooded the streets of Manhattan to glimpse his coffin, plate glass windows shattered in the desperate crush of the crowd, and a handful of heartbroken admirers were even said to have taken their own lives in their despair. His body was carried home to Hollywood, and here we meet our first mystery. For Valentino had died with his finances in ruin, and no tomb of his own, and so a devoted friend, the screenwriter June Mathis, offered him one of the 2 crypts that she owned as a temporary place to rest. Temporary, it was meant to be, and yet the great lover has never left it, lying to this very day in a borrowed grave that was never truly his own. And there is a second mystery, deeper still, for beginning soon after his burial, a mysterious figure draped entirely in black began to appear on the anniversary of his death, laying a single red rose upon his crypt, and then silently vanishing. The true identity of that original lady in black never certainly known, imitated by many pretenders over the long years, but solved by no one at all. He rests here still, borrowed and beloved and forever young. Let us stay here within Hollywood forever, and walk a little way to the resting place of a man whose death remains, even now, one of the most tantalizing unsolved murders in the entire history of this town. William Desmond Taylor was one of the most respected and admired film directors of the early 1920s, an elegant, cultured, and courtly Englishman at the very peak of a distinguished career. Yet even his own name was a kind of disguise, for he had been born William Dean Tanner and had mysteriously abandoned an earlier life and identity years before, reinventing himself entirely in Hollywood. On the morning of the 2nd of February, 1922, he was found dead upon the floor of his Los Angeles bungalow, killed by a single gunshot to the back, and the discovery detonated a scandal that shook the young movie colony to its very foundations. The investigation that followed was a chaotic and compromised circus, and it soon seemed that almost everyone involved had something to hide. Suspicion fell heavily upon the beloved comedienne Mabel Normand, who had been the last known person to see him alive and whose struggles with drugs were tangled up in the case, and upon the young ingenue Mary Miles Minter, whose desperate infatuation with the older director became painfully and publicly known, and upon a mysterious valet who had recently vanished without a trace. Incriminating letters were spirited away from the scene before the police even arrived. Alibis shifted like sand, and the terrified studios worked frantically behind the curtains to shield their stars from ruin. The crime was never solved. No one was ever charged. And though a string of supposed deathbed confessions surfaced over the following decades, none was ever proven, and the true answer was buried along with the director himself. The lurid affair helped to usher in a whole era of strict moral censorship over the movies, so that even in death, Taylor reshaped the very industry he had served. He rests here now, and the question of who fired that fatal shot has echoed unanswered for more than 100 years. Now let us travel a short way to the vast and stately Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, spread across its rolling hills, to consider a death so strange that it has baffled investigators and armchair detectives alike for the better part of a century. Thelma Todd was a luminous and genuinely gifted comedic actress, nicknamed the Ice Cream Blonde, a bright star of dozens of screwball comedies who had also become a shrewd businesswoman, running a popular seaside cafe that bore her own name. She was beautiful, she was successful, and she was, by every account, brimming with life. And then, on the morning of the 16th of December, 1935, she was found dead at just 29 years old, seated behind the wheel of her convertible inside a closed garage above her cafe, having died from carbon monoxide poisoning. At first, the death was quietly ruled a suicide, and then, with suspicious speed, that verdict was overturned in favor of a finding of accidental death, the comfortable theory being that she had started the engine merely to keep warm and had been overcome by the fumes. But almost no one who studied the details was ever satisfied. There were faint traces of blood, unanswered questions about the state of her fine evening clothes and her shoes, and a tangled web of relationships that gave more than one person a plausible motive for murder. Suspicion has swirled ever since around her volatile ex-husband, around her brooding business partner and director Roland West, who was rumored to have made a quiet confession on his own deathbed, and even around a notorious mobster said to have wanted a piece of her lucrative cafe. Was it truly an accident, a suicide, or a murder cleverly staged to resemble one? The official file was slammed shut within days, but the debate over it has never once closed. Her body was cremated, and her ashes were later placed within her own mother's casket, so that mother and daughter now rest together here. The secret of that cold December morning resting silently with them. Let us now journey to the quiet Mountain View Cemetery in nearby Altadena, to a glassed-in mausoleum niche that holds the ashes of a man who was, to an entire generation of children, the very embodiment of truth and justice, and whose own death was anything but clear or just. George Reeves was television's original Superman, the strong-jawed, kindly, reassuring star of the wildly popular series who taught a nation of young viewers to believe that a man could truly fly. Behind the cape, however, his real life was far more complicated than his heroic image, entangled in a long and open affair with Toni Mannix, the wife of a powerful and feared studio executive, and shadowed by frustration at a career that the Superman role had both created and imprisoned. And on the 16th of June, 1959, at 45 years old, he was found dead in an upstairs bedroom of his home from a single gunshot wound, on a night when several guests were gathered downstairs. The death was officially ruled a suicide, and there were reasons one might believe it, for he had grown despondent over his stalled career. But almost immediately that ruling was challenged, and the challenges have never stopped since. Observers pointed to the curious absence of his fingerprints upon the weapon, to the angle of the fatal shot, to additional bullet holes discovered in the room, and to the powerful and dangerous people whose secrets he was privy to, and they wondered aloud whether it had been a careless accident, or something far more sinister. His grieving mother flatly refused to accept the verdict, and spent years and a small fortune trying to force the case reopened, even having his body shipped across the country to Cincinnati and back in her relentless search for the truth. He was cremated at last and laid to rest here in Altadena, his strange death later dramatized on the screen. And the true story of how the Man of Steel met his end remains, to this very day, a genuine and troubling Hollywood mystery. Now let us travel to the small and hidden Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park, tucked away improbably among the towering office buildings of the city, to stand before the most visited crypt of them all, that of a woman whose death became perhaps the most fiercely debated in all of Hollywood history. Marilyn Monroe was, and forever remains, the ultimate symbol of Hollywood glamour and of its heartbreak, a luminous, vulnerable, endlessly imitated star. On the 5th of August, 1962, she was found dead in her Los Angeles home at just 36 years old, in the middle of shooting an unfinished film, and the coroner ruled her death a probable suicide from an overdose of barbiturates. Yet, from the very first, that official conclusion has been surrounded by a gathering storm of doubt and speculation that has never abated. Sharp questions were raised about strange inconsistencies in the timeline of her final night, about long delays in the summoning of help, about the conduct of the investigation itself, and about her rumored private connections to some of the most powerful men in America. And out of those questions grew 1,000 theories, a few of them plausible and most of them not, all of them working to keep her last night forever unsettled. What is not in dispute is the tenderness of her farewell. Her former husband, the baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, heartbroken and openly blaming the film industry for her destruction, arranged a small and strictly private funeral, pointedly barring the Hollywood establishment, and he had fresh red roses delivered to her crypt several times a week for the next 20 years. Her simple wall crypt, number 24, is worn smooth by countless hands and often marked with the lipstick kisses of her admirers, and the publisher Hugh Hefner quietly purchased the crypt directly beside her so that he might spend eternity at her side. She rests here now, adored and unknowable, her mystery every bit as enduring as her fame. Let us remain here within this same small cemetery and walk only a few steps to another famous grave. For Westwood is home to a second great Hollywood mystery, one that unfolded not in a bedroom, but upon the dark and rolling waters off a California island. Natalie Wood was a beloved star from her earliest childhood. The radiant actress of Miracle on 34th Street, Rebel Without a Cause, and West Side Story, a three-time Academy Award nominee cherished across the generations. On the night of the 29th of November, 1981, during a weekend boating trip near Catalina Island with her husband, the actor Robert Wagner, and a younger co-star, she vanished from the yacht in the darkness, and her body was found the next morning floating in the cold sea some distance away, clad in a nightgown and a heavy coat. She was 43 years old. The death was originally ruled an accidental drowning, the assumption being that she had slipped while trying to secure a small rubber dinghy that kept knocking against the hull. But the questions lingered for decades, sharpened by the fact that she was known to have had a deep and lifelong fear of dark water, by the bruises discovered upon her body, and by the shifting accounts of those who had been aboard that boat, until at last, in 2011, the Los Angeles authorities formally reopened the case. The cause of death was officially amended to drowning and other undetermined factors, and her husband was later publicly described by investigators as a person of interest, though he has never been charged with any crime and has always steadfastly maintained that the tragedy was a terrible accident. In the decades since, the yacht's captain, who had been aboard that night along with her co-star Christopher Walken, publicly changed his story more than once, hinting at a bitter argument he had witnessed before she vanished, and each new telling only thickened the fog around her final hours. She rests here at Westwood now, and the sea has kept its own dark secret about exactly what happened on that cold November night. Now let us leave California entirely and travel far to the north, to the green and rain-washed grounds of Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle, to the graves of a father and a son whose linked and untimely deaths gave rise to one of the most persistent legends in all of entertainment, the whispered and shivering story of a family curse. Bruce Lee was the martial arts master who changed cinema forever, an electrifying, disciplined, and deeply philosophical performer who brought kung fu to the wider world and became, in his brief and brilliant life, a global icon of strength and grace. And then, at the shocking age of just 32, he collapsed and died in Hong Kong in July of 1973, only weeks before the release of Enter the Dragon, the very film that would seal his legend forever. The official cause was a swelling of the brain, attributed to a rare reaction to a common painkiller he had taken for a headache, but the sheer suddenness of the death of so vital and superbly conditioned a man stunned the world and gave rise at once to darker murmurs of jealous rivals, of secret societies, of poison, and of an ancient curse said to hang over his family line. Only months earlier he had suffered a mysterious and nearly identical collapse, which only deepened the enigma. He had collapsed at the apartment of a colleague in Kowloon after complaining of a headache, and he left behind an unfinished film, tellingly titled Game of Death, that would only add to the eerie air gathering around him. His grieving widow brought him home to Seattle to be buried, far from the media frenzy of Hong Kong, and among his pallbearers were his friends, the movie stars Steve McQueen and James Coburn. He lies here now beneath a stone that names him the founder of his own martial art, a legend taken at the very height of his powers, the whispered curse trailing behind him like a lengthening shadow. And that shadow, tragically, seemed only to grow, for beside Bruce Lee lies his only son. Let us stand now at the grave directly beside his father's, where Brandon Lee rests, a young man whose death seemed to lend a terrible and undeniable weight to the very legend that had haunted his family for 20 years. Brandon was a gifted actor and martial artist in his own right, handsome, charismatic, and poised upon the very edge of the stardom his father had known, and he had been cast as the brooding lead in a dark and stylish supernatural film called The Crow. He was just 28 years old, deeply in love, and only weeks away from his own wedding. But on the set, in the small hours of a March morning in 1993, a scene called for a prop gun to be fired in his direction, and through a catastrophic and almost unimaginable chain of oversights, the tip of a dummy round had earlier become lodged, unnoticed, deep within that gun's barrel. And when the blank was fired, it drove the fragment out like a real bullet. Brandon was struck, and despite many hours of desperate surgery, he could not be saved. The accident was so freakish, so cruel, and so eerily reminiscent of his own father's sudden death exactly 20 years before, that the old whispers of a family curse roared back into full and terrible life, and many who had once scoffed now fell into an uneasy silence. The film was completed using doubles and early digital trickery, and he was laid to rest here in Seattle beside the father he had lost as a boy, beneath a stone bearing a passage meant for the wedding invitation he never got to send. Released the following year, The Crow became a haunting cult classic, forever inseparable from the real tragedy that had claimed its star. And the passage carved upon Brandon's stone, drawn from a favorite novel, speaks of how few sunrises any of us ever truly pause to notice, before our own time is unexpectedly done. Father and son lie together now, two brilliant lives cut short 2 decades apart, and the question of coincidence or curse hangs heavy over their shared and sorrowful ground. Let us now cross the ocean to Paris, to the romantic and crumbling grandeur of Père Lachaise Cemetery, to one of the most visited and most defaced graves in all the world, that of a poet-musician who died young and far from home. Jim Morrison was the magnetic and self-destructive frontman of The Doors, a wild and poetic presence who styled himself the Lizard King and who burned through his brief fame like a falling comet. In the summer of 1971, having fled to Paris to escape the crushing pressures of stardom and to reinvent himself as a serious writer, he was found dead in the bathtub of his rented apartment at just 27 years old, joining the tragic company of rock legends lost at that same fateful age. And here the mystery deepens sharply, for no autopsy was ever performed upon his body, the official cause of death recorded simply as heart failure on the word of the only other person present, his companion Pamela Courson, who would herself die a few years later. In the total absence of any real medical examination, rumor rushed to fill the void, with theories of an overdose in the bathroom, of a nightclub, of a hushed-up scandal, of a body seen by almost no one, even of a death faked so that he could disappear. None of them ever proven, and none ever fully laid to rest. Pamela Courson, the one person who might have said what truly happened in that apartment, offered only a sparse and shifting account and died herself not long afterward, and in the years since a Paris nightclub figure has claimed that Morrison actually overdosed at his club and was quietly carried home. A confession that can no longer be tested against anyone still living. His grave, once so modest that visitors struggled to find it, became a shrine and a battleground, so heavily coated in graffiti and crowded with weeping pilgrims and heaped offerings, that the cemetery was forced to place a barrier around it, and even the bronze bust that once marked the spot was stolen away and never recovered. He rests here still, in that famous city of the dead, his true final hours as unknowable as the poetry he left behind. Now let us return across the sea and travel to Louisiana, to the Garden of Memories Cemetery in the New Orleans suburb of Metairie, to the grave of a musician whose body endured one of the strangest and most macabre journeys in the entire history of the dead. Graham Parsons was a visionary singer and songwriter, the man who fused country music with rock and roll into something wholly new, inspiring countless artists who followed and mentoring a young Emmylou Harris, though true mainstream fame always eluded him in his own short life. He had fallen deeply and mystically in love with the stark beauty of the California desert around Joshua Tree, and he had told his road manager and close friend, a colorful character named Phil Kaufman, that when the time came he wished to be cremated out there among the twisted trees, his ashes set free in the wilderness he loved. In September of 1973, at just 26 years old, Parsons died of drug and alcohol toxicity at a small inn near the park, and what happened next belongs less to a funeral than to an outlaw legend. Determined to honor his friend's strange wish, Kaufman and an accomplice brazenly intercepted the coffin at the Los Angeles airport before it could be shipped to the family, loaded it into a borrowed hearse, drove it out into the desert to a rock formation Graham had loved, and there set the casket alight beneath the wide and open sky. Startled campers reported the blaze, and the two men were soon caught, though there existed no clear law against the stealing of a body, and they were fined only for the coffin they had burned. The strange desert cremation was carried out at a great boulder called Cap Rock, and the whole bizarre episode would later be retold in books and even a feature film, cementing Graham Parsons as much a legend for the theft and burning of his body as for the beautiful music he had made. What remained of Parsons was recovered and quietly buried here near New Orleans, so that his rest is forever split between the desert that briefly claimed him in fire and this quiet southern grave. Let us travel now to Memphis, Tennessee, to the most famous private home in all of American music, Graceland, where in the peaceful meditation garden lies the king of rock and roll himself, in a grave that is not, in fact, his first. Elvis Presley needs no introduction from anyone. the towering, revolutionary talent who fused the music of a divided nation and changed popular culture forever, and who died at Graceland on the 16th of August, 1977. At just 42 years old, his passing officially attributed to heart failure, though the heavy toll of years of prescription drug use remains to this day a subject of painful and unresolved controversy. He was first laid to rest, not here at all, but in a mausoleum at nearby Forest Hill Cemetery, beside his beloved mother, Gladys. But within weeks of that burial, a bizarre and alarming plot was uncovered, an apparent scheme by a small group of men to break into the mausoleum and steal the king's body itself. Whether to hold it for ransom or for some stranger motive was never made entirely clear. In the wake of that shocking and thwarted attempt, and in order to better protect and honor him, Elvis and his mother were both moved to the grounds of Graceland itself, to the tranquil meditation garden, where he could rest at last behind the guarded gates of his own beloved home. And even that has never been quite enough to settle him in the public imagination, for from the very moment of his death a stubborn and enduring belief took root that Elvis had not truly died at all, that he had faked his own passing to escape the unbearable weight of his fame, and reported sightings of the king have persisted for decades since. Just weeks after the first burial, 3 men were arrested in a clumsy scheme to break into the Forest Hill Mausoleum and make off with the king's body, and it was in the wake of that alarming scare that his father, Vernon, arranged for both Elvis and Gladys to be brought behind the protective walls of Graceland. He rests here now at Graceland, visited by many hundreds of thousands of pilgrims each year. At once, the most mourned and the most doubted death in all of music. Now let us sail out to the windswept island of Martha's Vineyard, off the coast of Massachusetts, to the small and rustic Abel's Hill Cemetery, where a comic genius lies buried in a grave that was deliberately designed to fool the very fans who love him most. John Belushi was a force of nature, an explosively funny and physically fearless performer who became a genuine superstar through the early years of Saturday Night Live and the film Animal House, adored by millions for his manic energy and his enormous, reckless heart. His life ended far too soon. In March of 1982, at just 33 years old, from a drug overdose in a bungalow at a Hollywood hotel, a death that shocked and grieved his legions of admirers around the world. He was buried here on the peaceful island that he had come to love, his funeral procession led by his grief-stricken friend Dan Aykroyd. But his grave almost immediately became a problem, for so many fans made the pilgrimage to it, and so many of them left behind bottles and cigarettes and littered the once quiet ground in raucous tribute, that the site simply could not be kept in any kind of peace. And so his family made a quiet and rather clever decision. His actual remains were moved to a different, unmarked location elsewhere within the same cemetery, while the original headstone was left standing right where it was to keep drawing the crowds, a decoy keeping watch over an empty patch of earth. To this day, visitors gather solemnly at that marker, most of them entirely unaware that the man himself lies somewhere nearby but apart, and rumors have long persisted that his remains may have been moved yet again, perhaps even home to his family in Illinois. The simple fieldstone marker that fans still faithfully visit is inscribed with a line about how, though he may be gone, the laughter and the rock and roll live on, a strangely fitting decoy for a performer who spent his whole life making an audience look one way while he darted, grinning, the other. He rests here on the vineyard, hidden in plain sight, playing one last quiet trick upon the world that adored him. Now let us travel to the Texas coast, to Seaside Memorial Park in the city of Corpus Christi, to a grave enclosed behind a protective black fence, where a beloved young singer lies, the victim of a betrayal that stunned an entire nation. Selena Quintanilla was the queen of Tejano music, a radiant, joyful, and hugely talented superstar poised right on the very brink of crossing over into worldwide pop stardom, adored by millions as she carried her music to ever larger and more devoted audiences. She was only 23 years old, newly triumphant and brimming with promise, when on the 31st of March, 1995, her life was taken in the cruelest way imaginable, shot and killed in a Corpus Christi motel room by Yolanda Saldivar, the president of her own fan club, and a trusted employee who had been confronted over money she had stolen. The killer was swiftly convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and yet the case has refused to fade quietly into the past, roaring back into the headlines and tearing open old wounds each time the grim possibility of her killer's parole arises. as it did once more only recently. Selena's death robbed the world of a talent that was only beginning to reveal its full and dazzling brilliance, and it inspired a beloved film and a lasting devotion. Her grave became at once a permanent place of pilgrimage, so constantly visited, and so sadly troubled at times by vandalism, that it now sits enclosed within a black protective fence, her lovely portrait gazing out from her dark headstone, while a bronze statue of her overlooks the bay not far away. In 2025, 3 full decades after the murder, her killer became eligible for parole for the very first time and was firmly refused, a grim milestone that sent a fresh wave of grief and anger rolling through the millions who still hold Selena's memory close to their hearts. She rests here now beside the sea she once sang beside, a queen taken far too soon, mourned by a love that the passing years have done nothing at all to dim. Now we come to a resting place that is not a grave at all, but a genuine and enduring mystery in its own right, the deeply uncertain fate of a rapper whose murder remains one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in the history of music. Tupac Shakur was one of the single most influential artists of his entire generation, a fierce, brilliant, and poetic voice whose words still resonate with enormous power today. On the 7th of September, 1996, following a boxing match on the Las Vegas Strip, he was shot several times from a passing car while stopped at a red light, and 6 days later he died of his wounds at just 25 years old. For nearly 3 full decades, the crime went formally unsolved, the identity of his killers the subject of endless investigation, documentary, and feverish speculation, before an arrest at last came many years afterward. But it is in death that Tupac becomes truly and genuinely elusive. For after he died, he was cremated, and the ultimate fate of his ashes has become a mystery all its own. It was widely reported that his remains were given to his mother, and that a portion was released to the wind above the Pacific, while in one famous and startling account, his fellow musicians in the group he had founded mixed some of his ashes with cannabis and smoked them in his honor. A memorial garden bearing a bronze statue of him was established in the state of Georgia, only to be later sold off and quietly dismantled. And more recently, a writer has claimed that his ashes were in fact buried in secret upon an abandoned property in North Carolina. Add to all of this the stubborn and widespread belief, among many of his fans, that he never truly died at all, that he faked his own death and lives on somewhere in hiding, and you have a legend whose final resting place is, quite genuinely, unknown to the world. He rests, if he rests at all, everywhere and nowhere at once, a mystery to the very end. Let us return now to California, to the enormous Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, to the guarded and gilded halls of its great mausoleum, where the king of pop lies in a grave that almost no living soul is permitted to see. Michael Jackson was the most famous entertainer on the entire planet, a once-in-a-century talent whose music and dancing reshaped global popular culture, and whose life, in its later and troubled years, became a subject of relentless fascination and fierce, unending controversy. On the 25th of June, 2009, as he prepared for a grand comeback series of concerts, he died with terrible suddenness at his rented Los Angeles home at just 50 years old. The cause was determined to be acute intoxication from a powerful surgical anesthetic that had been given to him disastrously to help him sleep. And in a case that gripped the whole world, his personal physician was tried, convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and sent to prison, though debate over the full circumstances of that final morning has never entirely quieted. And in death, Michael Jackson has become nearly as inaccessible as he so often was in life, for he was entombed within a private and heavily secured wing of the great mausoleum that is firmly closed to the general public, a section that ordinary fans may not enter and can scarcely even glimpse from a distance. There are no crowds permitted to gather at his crypt, no lipstick kisses pressed to the marble, no heaped offerings of flowers, only a profound silence behind locked and gilded bronze doors. He had been rehearsing an ambitious 50-show comeback residency, billed as his final curtain call, at the very moment that he died, and on the anniversary of his passing, his devoted fans still gather outside the mausoleum's locked doors each year, able to leave their flowers and their letters only at a respectful distance from the man they came so far to mourn. He rests here now, in a seclusion as complete as any he ever sought in his lifetime. The most famous man in all the world lying in one of the very least visitable graves, his mystery preserved forever behind cold marble and guarded gates. Now let us cross once more to England, to the vast and rolling parkland of the Althorpe estate in the county of Northamptonshire, to a grave set upon a small wooded island in the middle of a tranquil ornamental lake, where a princess rests in a seclusion that the whole world respects, but that almost no one will ever see. Diana, Princess of Wales, was perhaps the most photographed and most beloved woman on the face of the earth, a figure of extraordinary warmth, compassion, and glamour, whose every movement was followed by an adoring and utterly relentless public. On the 31st of August, 1997, in the small hours of the morning, she was killed in a car crash within a Paris road tunnel at just 36 years old, along with her companion Dodi Fayed and their driver, as their car sped away from a swarm of pursuing photographers. The official investigations that followed, conducted with great thoroughness on both sides of the channel, concluded firmly that the crash had been a tragic accident, caused by a driver who was speeding and gravely impaired as he tried to escape the chasing paparazzi. And yet, for a death so sudden and so world-shaking, striking down so beloved a figure at the very height of her fame, the official verdict was somehow never enough for everyone, and a dense tangle of conspiracy theories took root that endures stubbornly to this day. Her family chose to lay her to rest, not in some public churchyard where the crowds and the cameras could follow, but in the most private place they could possibly offer, upon a small tree-shaded island in the middle of a lake on the grounds of her ancestral home, a spot her brother deliberately selected so that she might finally know the peace and the privacy that her fame had always so cruelly denied her. No visitors may ever reach the island itself. She rests there alone upon the still water, watched over only from the distant shore, as utterly unreachable now in death as she was inescapable in life. Now let us return to America, to Machpelah Cemetery in the borough of Queens in New York City, to the grave of the greatest escape artist who ever lived, a man who spent his whole life breaking free from every trap and chain devised, and whose own death and grave are wrapped in mystery even now. Harry Houdini was a genuine global sensation, the master magician and fearless daredevil who could slip any handcuff, escape from any locked and submerged box, and thrill any crowd on earth, and who in his later years waged a fierce and very public crusade against the fraudulent spiritualists who falsely claimed to speak with the dead. On Halloween of 1926, Houdini died at the age of 52, of peritonitis brought on by a ruptured appendix. But the exact circumstances have been debated furiously ever since. For only days before, a college student had been permitted to test the showman's famous boast that he could withstand any blow to the stomach, and had struck him several hard times. Quite possibly before Houdini had properly braced himself for the impact. Was the burst appendix truly the result of those sudden punches, or merely a coincidental illness? Or, as some have very darkly speculated, the secret work of vengeful enemies among the spiritualists he had so relentlessly and publicly exposed as frauds? His grand grave monument, an elegant curved bench crowned with a bronze bust of the magician, has itself become the target of continual mystery and misfortune, the bust vandalized and even stolen outright more than once across the long years. And every Halloween, magicians still gather here to perform the solemn rituals of their ancient craft in his memory. Some of them still faintly hoping, just as his own devoted widow once did through a full decade of seances, that the man who escaped from everything might yet find some way to send a message back. He rests here now, his final and greatest escape, perhaps still quietly in progress. Now let us travel to Baltimore, Maryland, to the old and deeply atmospheric Westminster burying ground beside its ivy-clad church, to the grave of a master of mystery whose own death was the greatest and the darkest riddle he never lived to solve. Edgar Allan Poe was the brilliant and tormented author who all but invented the modern detective story and who perfected the Gothic tale of terror, a writer whose feverish and glittering imagination gave the world some of its most haunting poems and its most unforgettable nightmares. And his death, fittingly and terribly, reads like something torn straight from one of his own darkest tales. In early October of 1849, Poe was discovered on the streets of Baltimore, delirious, disheveled, and inexplicably wearing clothes that were not his own, utterly unable to explain what had befallen him. He was carried to a hospital, where he drifted in and out of a feverish consciousness for several days, reportedly crying out over and over a single name that no one present could identify. And then, On the 7th of October, he died at just 40 years old, never once having become lucid enough to tell anyone his story. No certain cause of death was ever established, and the competing theories are many and strange, ranging from the ravages of alcohol to rabies to a sinister political practice of that era in which unfortunate men were kidnapped, drugged, and forced to vote again and again in a rigged election. Whatever the truth, it went with him silently into the ground. And, for many decades afterward, a mysterious cloaked figure, known only as the Poe Toaster, appeared faithfully at this grave in the dead of each year on the author's birthday, leaving behind 3 roses and a bottle of fine cognac, before slipping away again into the darkness, a ritual every bit as enigmatic as the man it honored, until one year the shadowy visitor simply came no more. He rests here now. His death, an unsolved mystery worthy of his own dark and immortal pen. Let us make our way now back across the Atlantic once more, to the tranquil little village of Coursier-sur-Vevey in Switzerland, perched high above the shining shores of Lake Geneva, to the grave of the most beloved comedian the world has ever known, a grave that once, quite astonishingly, stood gaping and empty. Charlie Chaplin was the immortal little tramp, the genius of the silent screen whose battered bowler hat and twirling cane and waddling, hopeful walk made him very possibly the most recognizable human being on the entire planet, and who lived out his final peaceful years in gentle exile here in this quiet Swiss village. He died on Christmas Day of 1977, at the grand old age of 88, and was buried simply in the village cemetery near his beloved home. And there, surely, his long story should have ended, but it did not. For just over 2 months later, on a dark and moonless March night in 1978, 2 grave robbers crept into the little cemetery, dug up the great comedian's coffin, and carried it away into the night, and then demanded an enormous ransom, some $600,000, from his widow, Una, for the safe return of his body. She flatly refused to be extorted, reportedly remarking with quiet dignity that Charlie would have thought the whole grim affair perfectly ridiculous, while the patient police tapped the family's telephone and kept watch over hundreds of public phone booths scattered across the region. After 11 strange and anxious weeks, the 2 rather hapless culprits, a pair of immigrant mechanics, were finally caught, and they led the authorities to a nearby cornfield where they had reburied the stolen coffin. Chaplin was brought home at last and laid once more into his grave, but this time his family would take no further chances, encasing his resting place within a thick and unbreakable shell of concrete so that the little tramp might never be disturbed again. He rests here now beneath his protective tomb, having given the astonished world, even in death, one last story that was equal parts tender comedy and outright crime. And so we come at last to the oldest and perhaps the most profoundly haunting mystery of all, and for it we must travel to Vienna, to the peaceful and leafy grounds of St. Mark's Cemetery, in search of a grave that no one on earth can truly find. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was one of the supreme creative geniuses in the entire history of human art, a composer whose glorious music has moved, delighted, and consoled the world for well over 2 centuries, and whose melodies remain as instantly familiar today as they were in his own lifetime. He died in Vienna in December of 1791, at just 35 years old, and even the true cause of his death is a matter of enduring debate among scholars, most likely a severe fever or a rheumatic illness, though a persistent and colorful old legend, almost certainly false, has long whispered that a jealous musical rival crept in and poisoned him. But the very deepest mystery lies in what became of him afterward. Contrary to the popular and enduring myth that he was a destitute pauper flung carelessly into an anonymous mass grave, Mozart was in fact buried in strict accordance with the ordinary burial regulations of his day, laid to rest in a simple, unmarked common grave, exactly as the great majority of Viennese then were, his considerable fame notwithstanding. The trouble is that such graves bore no markers of any kind, and very few mourners attended the burial. His own widow Constance among those absent, and so, with truly astonishing swiftness, the exact location of the resting place of one of history's greatest artists was simply and completely lost. Later admirers, aghast that his grave had vanished from all memory, did their earnest best to identify the most likely spot, and there today stands a mournful stone angel beside a broken column, marking the place where the composer most probably lies, though no one can ever say for certain. Even his very skull is the subject of a strange and unresolved dispute, a fragile relic held in a distant institution, and claimed by some to be his, its true authenticity never once proven. He rests here somewhere beneath this quiet and unremarkable ground, the man whose music the whole world knows by heart, and whose actual bones the world has never been able to find, the final and most profound mystery of our long night's walk together. And so our long journey through these mysterious and controversial graves comes at last to its end. We have traveled a very great distance tonight, from the borrowed crypt of a silent film idol to the lost and unmarked grave of a musical immortal, from a decoy headstone standing watch on a windswept island, to a coffin stolen away in the Swiss night and held for ransom, from unsolved murders and hotly disputed suicides to bodies burned in the desert and ashes scattered upon the wind. We have stood before legends whose deaths no one can fully explain, and legends whose graves cannot even be located, and legends who may, in the stubborn and loving imaginations of their fans, not be entirely gone at all. And through the whole of it, we have tried to hold two things gently together in our hands: a deep respect for the dead, and an honest reckoning with the questions that swirl around them. For these mysteries are not merely morbid curiosities to be gawked at. They are, in their own strange and stubborn way, a true measure of just how deeply these figures were loved. For we do not spin endless theories and leave fresh roses and keep faithful vigil at the graves of those we have already forgotten. We do it only for the ones who truly mattered, the ones whose stories felt somehow far too large and too luminous to end in something as small and as ordinary as a quiet death. The uncertainty that clings to their resting places is, perhaps, the very last gift that their legend offers us, a reason to keep returning, to keep wondering, and to keep speaking their names aloud into the gathering dark. Notice, if you will, one last quiet thread that has run through the whole of our journey tonight. In very nearly every case, the mystery did not diminish the legend but somehow magnified it, drawing us back again and again to a grave we might otherwise have wandered past without a second glance. The unanswered question is itself a kind of tether, binding the living to the dead, stubbornly refusing to let the story close. It is why a stranger dressed all in black returned year upon year to a borrowed crypt, why devotees still gather at a locked mausoleum door bearing flowers they cannot deliver, why magicians still whisper to an empty grave on Halloween night, and why a cloaked figure once crept faithfully through the Baltimore dark to leave 3 roses and a bottle of cognac for a poet already a century gone. We are, every one of us, just a little unwilling to accept that the people who once filled our imaginations could simply cease to be, and so we keep their mysteries carefully alive as a way of keeping them alive. And perhaps that is not morbid in the least. Perhaps it is only a strange and stubborn form of love, the very same impulse that makes any of us reluctant to say a final goodbye to someone we have truly cherished. Perhaps these legends, wherever it is that they truly rest tonight, would not mind so terribly much that we simply cannot bring ourselves to let them go. So let the coroners and the historians go on arguing among themselves. We came here tonight for something simpler and gentler than an answer. We came only to remember them, and to stand together for a quiet moment in that beautiful and unsettling silence where the answers ought to be. For tonight, the questions belong to the darkness, and the darkness, as ever, keeps them well, holding its silent counsel long after we have turned for home. Rest well, friends, all of you, whatever secrets you may have carried down with you into the ground. And rest well to each of you as well, my fellow travelers on this strange and shadowed road. Until we walk together again.